Matilda II is the only British tank to have served through the entire Second World War from beginning to end. On May 21, 1940, 16 British tanks achieved the impossible and halted the entire German army, changing the course of world history. These machines struck the flank of the 7th Panzer Division under the command of Erwin Rommel. What happened next forced the German command to issue an order that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But first things first. The spring of 1940 was a true nightmare for the Allies. German tank wedges were breaking through French and British defenses with frightening ease, and it seemed that nothing could stop this steel avalanche. The British Expeditionary Force was retreating toward the coast, and panic reigned in the headquarters. It was at this moment that the command made a desperate decision to launch a counterstrike to slow the German advance even slightly. For this suicidal attack, they gathered everything at hand, specifically the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments. At their disposal were 58 Matilda I light tanks armed with machine guns and only 16 of the latest Matilda II models, which had just begun entering service. In the early morning, this small group moved to attack near the city of Arras. No one expected anything special from them, as the task was simple: strike, distract the enemy, and perish to buy time for the retreating units. However, something completely unexpected occurred. When the Matilda II models reached the positions of the 7th Panzer Division, German gunners opened fire with their standard 37mm anti-tank guns. Shells struck the armor of the British machines and simply bounced off without causing any damage. The German crews could not believe their eyes, as their guns, which had previously easily pierced any French or Polish equipment, proved utterly powerless. The Matildas continued their advance, methodically firing at everything in their path. Their 2-pounder guns operated with lethal accuracy, destroying trucks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery positions. Infantry fled in panic, and soldiers of the elite SS Totenkopf Division, considered among the best in the German army, simply ran from the battlefield, abandoning weapons and equipment. This was unthinkable, as until that moment, the German army had known no defeats in this campaign. News of the counterattack instantly reached the high command. The generals were in shock because they did not understand where the British had obtained tanks that were impossible to knock out by conventional means. In the headquarters, there was talk of a major Allied counteroffensive, hidden reserves, and the possible encirclement of German units that had pushed too far ahead. Then came the order that changed everything. The German offensive was halted. Tank divisions were ordered to dig in and not advance further until the situation was clarified. These precious hours and days allowed hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers to reach Dunkirk, where evacuation across the Channel awaited them. Without this pause, the Germans would have captured the port earlier, and the entire British army would have been captured or destroyed. It can be said without exaggeration that 16 Matilda II tanks saved Britain from military catastrophe. However, Rommel himself quickly recovered and organized a defense. He gathered all available guns, including 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which were originally intended for combating aircraft. These powerful guns proved capable of piercing even the thick armor of the Matildas, and British losses began to mount rapidly. By the end of the day, only 2 combat-ready machines remained of the 16 Matilda II models, and only 25 of the 58 Matilda I models survived. All were abandoned during the subsequent evacuation from France, but this battle had far-reaching consequences. Rommel personally reported to the command that the British possessed tanks with impenetrable armor. This experience solidified the use of 88mm anti-aircraft guns in an anti-tank role and ultimately led to Hitler's demand for a tank capable of carrying such a gun. Thus, the idea of the Tiger was born, but that is a different story. For now, let us look at how the Matilda II appeared and why it proved so effective in those first years of the war. To understand why the Matilda II became such a special machine, one must return to the Britain of the 1930s, where economic chaos and military confusion reigned. The country had still not recovered from the Great Depression. The state treasury was empty, and debts from the First World War continued to weigh on the budget. Meanwhile, a new threat was looming in the form of a strengthening Germany. British military forces urgently required rearmament. The problem was that three branches of the military fought fiercely for meager military appropriations. The Royal Navy demanded money for new ships. The Royal Air Force insisted on building fighters and bombers, and the Army with its tanks found itself at the back of the line. Even the funds allocated for armor had to be divided according to the British tank doctrine of the time. The British believed they needed two types of tanks: slow and heavily armored infantry tanks to support advancing infantry, and fast cruiser tanks to perform cavalry functions. Thus, the already modest tank budget was cut in half. It was in these conditions that the Matilda I was born, serving as a clear example of what happens when economy becomes the primary design principle. The War Office set a strict cost ceiling of £6,000 per machine, and designers had to manage as best they could. The result was controversial, to say the least. This small tank, weighing only 11 tons, accommodated only 2 crew members. Its hull was so cramped that the engine, gearbox, and the tankers themselves barely fit. The tracks remained completely open and vulnerable to enemy fire, and the maximum speed was only 13 kilometers per hour. The only merit of the first Matilda was its armor. 60 millimeters on the sides and 65 millimeters at the front made this tank practically invulnerable to most anti-tank guns of the time. For comparison, early German Panzer III series tanks had armor of only 15 millimeters, which was later reinforced to 30. However, there was one critical omission that nullified all the advantages of protection. The turret of the first Matilda held only a 7.62 millimeter machine gun and nothing else. This tank was completely unable to fight enemy armor, destroy fortifications, or suppress enemy fire points. Unsurprisingly, the High Command remained extremely dissatisfied with such a machine. Even before the first Matilda entered service, in September 1936, a specification was issued for a new, larger, and better armed infantry tank. Thus began the history of the Matilda II, a machine of an entirely different class. The new tank retained the general hull shape with its characteristic pointed nose. However, it was now manufactured using casting rather than riveting. The machine became significantly larger and heavier, reaching a weight of 25 tons. The crew increased to 4 people, and 3 were accommodated in the spacious turret: the commander, gunner, and loader. The tracks received protective skirts, making them less vulnerable in combat. According to the technical requirements, the tank had to overcome anti-tank ditches nearly 2.5 meters wide, for which it was equipped with special mud scrapers on the tracks. The main trump card of the Matilda II was its armament. The 2-pounder 40mm gun was the best tank gun in the world at that time. It surpassed both German and French counterparts in armor penetration. A standard armor-piercing shell could penetrate 40 millimeters of armor at a 30-degree angle at a distance of almost 1 kilometer. Firing accuracy on the move was excellent, although when firing directly forward, a strange feature was observed. The suspension began to rock, which threw off the aim. However, production of the new tank faced serious difficulties. Vickers, the traditional manufacturer of British armor, was fully loaded with other orders. The contract for the Matilda II went to the Vulcan Foundry, which had previously built locomotives and had virtually no experience in tank construction. A shortage of qualified engineers and problems with component supplies meant that the first prototypes appeared only in April 1938, and the first 6 production machines were handed over to the Army only on October 31st, 1939, 1 month after the start of the war. This is why at Arras, the British had only 16 of these tanks. In the autumn of 1940, Benito Mussolini decided to take his share of the crumbling British Empire and ordered Italian troops in Libya to invade Egypt. The goal was the Suez Canal, control of which would allow cutting the main artery connecting Britain with its colonies in Asia. Thus began the war in the desert. It was here that the Matilda II experienced its finest hour, earning the legendary nickname Queen of the Desert. The Italian army significantly outnumbered British forces, but the quality of its armor left much to be desired. When the Matildas entered battle, a true slaughter occurred. Italian M1139 series tanks with their 37mm guns proved completely helpless against the British machines. Shells simply bounced off the thick armor of the Matildas, leaving not even serious dents. Moreover, even 100mm howitzers firing at point-blank range could not penetrate the protection of these tanks. British two-pounders, on the other hand, worked with surgical precision, piercing Italian armor through and through. In January 1941, B Squadron of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment participated in battles in Eritrea. During one engagement, B Troop attacked a column of 17 Italian tanks. The result of the battle was staggering. 13 enemy machines were destroyed, and the remaining 4 fled. Inspection of the knocked-out equipment showed how powerful the British gun was. 2-pounder shells pierced the Italian tanks completely, passing through the front armor, the engine, and exiting through the rear plate. Such destructive efficiency seemed almost unreal. British tankers felt like invulnerable masters of the desert. Matildas played a key role in the defeat of the Italian army and its retreat deep into Libya. Of course, mechanical problems made themselves known, as the twin bus engines required constant maintenance and the complex transmission was temperamental in heat and sand. But as long as the tank stayed mobile, it was practically invincible in combat with the Italians. Everything changed in early 1942 when the German Afrika Korps arrived in North Africa under the command of Erwin Rommel, who had already encountered Matildas at Arras. The Germans brought new weapons capable of dealing with British armor. 50mm Model 38 anti-tank guns could penetrate the front protection of the Matilda at medium ranges, which the old Model 36 could not do. In the open desert, with its vast distances and flat terrain, 88mm anti-aircraft guns turned into deadly anti-tank weapons, hitting targets from several kilometers away. The Germans quickly mastered anti-tank ambush tactics. They dug gun positions, camouflaged them, and waited for British tanks to approach within killing range. The Matilda, with its slow speed and inability to fire effective high-explosive shells, became easy prey in such situations. The 2-pounder was excellent against enemy armor, but it simply had no proper high-explosive ammunition to suppress artillery positions. On June 15, 1941, 16 Matildas of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment attacked German positions at the Halfaya Pass in Libya. British tankers went into a frontal attack against a camouflaged line of guns, unaware of what awaited them. When the Germans opened fire, the carnage began. 88mm shells pierced the Matilda armor that had recently seemed impenetrable. Of the 16 machines, only 1 returned. An even more terrible tragedy occurred in July 1942 at the Sidra Ridge. 70 Matildas in 2 waves attacked German positions reinforced with anti-tank guns of 88 and 50mm calibers. German gunners coolly shot down the approaching tanks, and by the end of the day, only 12 of the 70 machines survived. The Queen of the Desert had lost her crown. By October 42, almost no combat-ready Matildas remained in North Africa. German Panzer III and IV series tanks received reinforced armor and more powerful guns, making encounters with them increasingly dangerous. But the main problem was the impossibility of modernization. The turret ring of the Matilda was too small to install the new 6-pounder gun, which could have restored fire superiority. This required a larger turret, and widening the ring on the existing hull was technically impossible. New British tanks, such as the Valentine and Churchill, allowed for such modernization and were also simpler to produce. While the last Matildas of the British Commonwealth burned in the sands of North Africa, hundreds of their siblings were fighting in entirely different conditions on the vast expanses of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union became the largest recipient of these tanks under the Lend-Lease program, and the history of their service in the Red Army proved no less dramatic than in the desert. In total, the British sent 1,185 Matilda II tanks to the USSR, accounting for almost 40% of the total production of these machines. However, the route through the northern seas was deadly. Arctic convoys delivering cargo to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were under constant attack by German submarines and aircraft. The icy waters of the Barents Sea swallowed many transports along with precious equipment. About 900 machines reached Soviet ports. The rest on the seabed somewhere between Iceland and the Kola Peninsula. The tanks arrived at a critical moment. In 41 and early 42, Soviet tank industry had not yet reached full capacity after the evacuation of factories to the east. Every combat machine counted, and Matildas were immediately sent to the front. Soviet tankers quickly appreciated the main virtue of the British machine, namely its outstanding armor protection. In battle, the 75mm front armor inspired confidence, as standard German anti-tank guns of 37 and even 50mm caliber often proved powerless against it. However, Soviet military specialists viewed the foreign equipment critically and identified many shortcomings. The main complaint was speed. A maximum of 24 kilometers per hour on the road proved completely unacceptable compared to the domestic T-34, which developed over 50 kilometers per hour. In the conditions of maneuver warfare on the Eastern Front, where tank formations made rapid dashes and deep breakthroughs, the slow Matilda simply could not keep up with the tempo of operations. The second serious flaw noted by Soviet tankers was weak armament. The 2-pounder gun, which had performed so well in 40, no longer met the requirements of 42. German tanks received reinforced armor, and the 40mm shell increasingly failed to penetrate it at real combat distances. Soviet engineers made an attempt to install the domestic 76mm ZIS-5 gun on the Matilda. However, the experiment failed. The gun proved too large for the cramped British turret, and the idea had to be abandoned. However, Soviet tankers unexpectedly liked the modification of the Matilda with a 3-inch howitzer for direct infantry support. The British hardly used high-explosive shells for the 2-pounder, considering them ineffective. Soviet gunners found a use for them and actively fired at enemy infantry and fortifications, squeezing the maximum possible out of the British gun. The real test for the Matilda was the Russian winter. The design of the chassis, which worked perfectly in African heat, was completely unsuitable for frost. Snow and frozen mud clogged the numerous suspension rollers, and mechanics had to spend hours knocking out ice so the tank could move. Narrow tracks designed for the hard ground of the desert slipped helplessly on ice and snow. Soviet repairmen welded metal spikes to the tracks to somehow improve grip on icy surfaces. Engines also suffered from the cold. The twin power plant of 2 bus motors required thorough warming before starting, and the cooling system periodically froze. British technical fluids were not designed for 40-degree frosts, and Soviet mechanics had to improvise, replacing them with domestic analogs. Technical maintenance of an already complex machine turned into a nightmare. Despite all the shortcomings, Matildas honestly did their duty on the Eastern Front. They participated in the defensive battles of 42 when every tank was worth its weight in gold. Thick armor saved the lives of many Soviet crews who would otherwise have perished in more vulnerable machines. By mid-42, most Matildas were lost in battle or decommissioned due to wear. But by that point, Soviet industry had already established mass production of the T-34, and the need for foreign equipment significantly decreased. The British tank fulfilled its task, filling a critical gap in Soviet armored forces during the hardest period of the war. While factories beyond the Urals were gaining momentum, Matilda's held the defense and died in battle, giving the country time to mobilize its industry. At the other end of the globe, among the stifling tropical jungles of the Pacific Theater of Operations, the Matilda, too, found a second life. Here, far from deserts and snowy plains, this tank finally found the conditions for which it was originally created, namely for slow, methodical advancement alongside infantry through reinforced enemy positions. By mid-42, just over 200 Matilda II tanks had arrived in Australia. The condition of the equipment after the long sea voyage was poor, and almost half of the machines had to be dismantled for spare parts to keep the others operational. Nevertheless, about 100 tanks were prepared for combat, and Australian engineers immediately set about modifying them for the specific conditions of the tropical theater. The dense jungles of the Pacific Islands represented a completely unique environment for armor. Light American Stuart tanks possessed by the Allies struggled to break through the entanglement of vines and thick tree trunks. The Matilda, even with its 25 tons of weight and powerful construction, simply plowed its way through vegetation like a steel rhino. Where the Stuart got stuck or slipped, the British machine stubbornly moved forward, crushing everything in its path. Australians made several important modifications to increase survival in the jungle. Armored shields were installed on the track idler wheels to protect them from damage during collisions with trees. The turret ring received a special collar covering the vulnerable gap from close-range fire. The commander's cupola was redesigned to improve visibility in the limited sight conditions among dense vegetation. Crews independently modified their machines, attaching metal meshes and sand mats to the engine louvers to protect the engine from grenades that Japanese infantrymen tried to throw onto the rear of the tank. It was the proximity of the enemy that posed the main danger in the jungle. Japanese soldiers could sneak up to a tank within grenade-throwing distance, hiding in the brush literally a few meters from the machine. Their standard 37mm anti-tank gun proved just as useless against the Matilda's armor as Italian weaponry in Africa. Shells simply bounced off the thick armor plates without causing harm. Realizing the futility of artillery combat, the Japanese began to improvise. From heavy artillery shells, they crafted powerful high-explosive charges and buried them in the paths of armor. One of the tanks of the 2nd 9th Armored Regiment on Tarakan Island in Borneo ran over such a mine, and the monstrous explosion tossed the 25-ton machine to a height of about 5.5 meters. The tank crashed back to the ground, a mangled pile of metal. However, remarkably, the entire crew survived, escaping with only bruises and concussions. This became clear evidence of how strong the Matilda's construction was. Australians quickly realized the value of the modification with the 3-inch close-support howitzer. The high-explosive shells of this gun were perfectly suited for destroying Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. The compact ammunition allowed taking a significant supply on board, and its effectiveness against infantry and field fortifications was high. Tactics were changed accordingly. Tanks with howitzers now went first, performing the role of command vehicles, while 1 or 2 Matildas with 2-pounders followed behind for cover against possible enemy armor. However, the most fearsome weapon in the arsenal of Australian tankers was the flamethrower modification called the Frog. Instead of a gun, a powerful flamethrower was installed on the tank, capable of throwing a stream of burning mixture for dozens of meters. In jungle conditions, where the Japanese created extensive systems of underground fortifications and bunkers, this weapon proved lethally effective. Burning out a garrison from a deep shelter with conventional shells was practically impossible, but a flamethrower handled such a task in seconds. Almost 400 Matilda tanks of various modifications passed through the hands of the Australian Armed Forces during the war years. They participated in battles in New Guinea, Borneo, and many small islands, methodically supporting infantry in the most difficult conditions. When on August 15, 1945, Japan announced its capitulation, The Matilda II was still in service. From the first shots at Arras in May 40 to the last days of the war in the Pacific, exactly 6 years of continuous frontline service had passed. No other Allied tank can boast such an achievement. If you enjoyed this story about a tank that stopped armies, crossed continents, and served honestly until the last day of the war, support the video with a like and write in the comments which equipment you would like to hear about next time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.